Thanks, Shah. Welcome, everybody. This is the OBA Network Energy Community. It's a community that we've started with some alumni-led talks. I know that some of you have been attending those, and I'm delighted to introduce you four stellar panelists. Charmian Love, who's a social entrepreneur in residence at the Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship. Abrar Chaudhury, Research Fellow at Oxford Said and an MBA alum. Kaya Axelsson, researcher at the Environmental Change Institute, University of Oxford, and Kate Sandle, Director of Programs and Engagement at B Corp. And they're all here to talk about the climate emergency, the race to net zero. I'm just going to pass this over now to Claire Joubert from the Skoll Centre, who's going to talk about some of the research that they've done recently.
Hi everyone. Before I kind of hand over to Shah and the other contributors for the session, I am just going to give you a little bit of background. First of all, just to from a survey that we did recently at the Skoll Centre, where we sent a survey out via the alumni newsletter, which many of you will have received and possibly participated in yourselves as well. We were asking you to tell us about your kind of impact career, and we asked kind of quite a few questions as part of that survey. And specifically, one of the questions we asked was how many of you as alumni would be interested and kind of want to work for an organization that said it was committed to climate action. And an amazing 81% of you who responded said that you would want to work for an organization that was committed to serious climate action. So we had over 400 alumni reply to that survey. So we were really kind of encouraged and excited about that as to kind of what that kind of told us. We recognize a lot of the kind of respondents, were alumni who were kind of self-identifying as being in impact. However, we were really encouraged to see such a high percentage mention climate action specifically. And also over 40% of alumni who responded said that their work focused on SDG 13 specifically as well. So I kind of share that with you now as just to kind of set the scene a little bit for this conversation to kind of come, because there's clearly a lot of energy and a lot of you spending time and your kind of focus on this. So we're kind of very keen to kind of see what the conversation in this session goes like and to kind of continue the momentum and the work with you. So with that, I'll hand over to Shah, who'll start the session from here.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Claire, for the really great sort of framing of the survey, and a really giant thank you to Hannah and the team who've put together this really special webinar tonight. As she said, we're talking tonight about the climate emergency and the race to zero, and we are really lucky to have a panel of quite extraordinary thinkers and doers. And tonight, what we're going to try and do over the course of the next sort of 55 minutes or so is really talk a little bit about the climate emergency. What is it? Is it happening? How serious is it? And we've got a really incredible climate scientist and specialist in this with Abrar, who's going to share some of his recent research as well on climate finance. We're also going to talk about how. I mean, if we are living in a climate emergency, which I think we will all agree that we are, what can we do about it as businesses, as investors, as leaders? So we'll talk a little bit about what are the processes and the practices that are out there. Kai is going to share some excellent news around a net zero tool that's in development here at Oxford and share a little bit of the timeline so you guys can all be marking your calendars of when there will be some specific products for you to be able to engage with through this online aggregator of net zero tools. And then we're also going to be joined by Kate Sandle, because it is really important for us to be thinking in the context of the climate emergency and how we're going to take action. It's the approach that we take, because what we're recognizing right now is the climate emergency is happening, and we do need to make sure that we're thinking deeply and taking action on climate justice. And Kate's going to be sharing some of the work that's happening in the B Corp movement. So we've got a pretty wild ride in front of us for the next 55 minutes or so. We are going to make sure we have some time towards the end to get your questions. So start thinking about the sorts of things you would like to ask our panel of experts here tonight. We're not going to be using the chat function. Instead, please, can I direct you to the Q&A? We will be monitoring it and making sure that your voice is heard tonight as we explore this incredibly important topic. So giant thank you again to Hannah and the team, to Claire, to our incredible panelists, and to all of you for this Monday evening joining us for this first climate emergency, the Race to Zero event. What we'd like to do to kick things off is show a little video, because when we're thinking about the Race to Zero, there actually is a campaign that launched just a few weeks ago, and there's just a quick 1-minute short video we'd like to show to get everybody sort of feeling the energy of what this all means. So maybe Hannah, are you okay to play the video?
We are in a race against the climate emergency. Unlike most races, there won't be just one winner. In this race, we all win, or we all lose. Countries must lead the way in this race, but they cannot win it by themselves. This is why today, cities, regions, businesses, investors, and civil society are coming together to launch the Race to Zero, the largest ever coalition of leaders to commit to one goal: zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. To achieve that goal, we need to act now. Together, we'll be racing for a healthier, fairer, and safer world.
Excellent. I find it's always good to have a little bit of pumped up music for these sorts of sessions to sort of set the energy. Abrar's nodding his head because he knows we've played a lot of music in some of the classes we've run together. Well, with that, as said, we're in a climate emergency, and it is now time for all of us to figure out how we are going to be in this race to get to zero. So with that, I'd like to kick it off by throwing it over to Abrar, who's going to share a little bit about the work he's involved with around the climate emergency. And Abrar, as a way to introduce yourself, I know everyone can go online and see your bio and all the amazing things you've been up to, but I'd love you to actually, first question to address here is, what is your go-to power-up song? Like, what's the song that you play in the morning when you know you're about to go out and do some important climate action?
I think it would be Queen. So, you know, We Will Rock You. I think that's something that, you know, really gets me going. So yes, I'm all geared up for that.
Awesome. I think what we're going to do is after the formal end of this webinar, I think we should just, a couple of us might stay online and do like a little post-session dance party. So maybe we'll put Queen on to be the first song. Over to you, Abrar. Let's hear about the climate emergency and let's hear about your research in this area.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Shar, and thank you, Hannah, for inviting me. I think it's always a pleasure speaking to the alumni community. You know, as Shar mentioned, you know, I'm an MBA alumni as well. So, you know, it's always talking to my community. So I love it. So thank you so much. I think today I'm just going to put my slides on. Let me share my screen. All right, perfect. No, this is. All right. So do we have the full screen, right? Okay, perfect. So today, you know, I have about 15 minutes, and you know, when Shar invited me to speak about, you know, the science about climate change, you know, I really figured out like what would be the like interesting things to talk about. So I think today I'll go over, and I'm sure a lot of you already are familiar with some of these graphs, but I really want to talk about, you know, what has been happening in climate science. What are the facts that we know about climate science? You know, what is this talk about this 1.5 degree and this kind of net zero opportunity, and what does the world look like in a 1.5 degree world? And then maybe a little bit about the post-COVID impacts of climate change. And then finally, you know, I'll touch on the finance and some opportunities that we can think about in a post-COVID environment. So if we look at this picture, you we can see obviously the graph going up, right? And this is, annual temperature being tracked over the last 130, 140 years. And we can see that, by 2020, or we're almost actually 1 degree above what the temperature was. But what's really alarming is that, since 2001, we've had like 16 of the 17 most warmest years. And this is just in the last 20 years. And 2016 was actually ranked as the warmest year in history, which is, which says something that, the global temperature is rising. But why is that really happening? So if you look at the next graph, what we'll see is that this is basically a graph about CO2 emissions. And this is being tracked over thousands of years. And what we see is that, obviously in history, there's always been a variation in emissions. And so when people say, oh, no, climate change has already happened, that is true. There've been eras where, the CO2 emissions have gone up and then they've gone down, and those cycles continue over history. But what really stands out is when we actually look at the tail end of the graph. And, when we look at when humans started to industrialize in the last 100 years, our emissions have rapidly gone up. And right now we're over 400 ppm, which is, parts per million emission. And that's happened, after actually 3 million years. For the first time in history, after 3 million years, we've actually reached this emission level. And when we go back and track, what was happening 3 million years ago, we had actually trees in the South Pole. And the sea level rise was like 30, 40 meters high, which means like, mostly the entire world would be underwater. So obviously that's something that we don't want to happen. And this is something very alarming, but this can actually be tracked with how we've been industrializing. And so what the IPCC says is like since 1950, there's enough research to say that the current cycle of emissions is actually human induced. Before that, there were like, historical or natural phenomena that called the CO2 level to go up. But the last 50 years or last 100 years, all the CO2 emissions have been induced by humans, and that's backed by our use of fossil fuels and industrialization and our transportation and many other sectors as well. So that's something to keep in mind as we go along.
Abrar, sorry.
Yes.
Sorry, Abrar, just before you continue, I was just wondering whether you could make it full presenter view.
Oh, that's what I wanted to check. Is this full presenter view or no?
Not at the moment, no.
We're still seeing it in, yeah, we're seeing the split screen. So maybe if you just put it into the speaker view. There we go.
Is that full presenter? All right,
yeah,
perfect.
all good.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So there's been a lot of talk about this 1.5 degree, and the IPCC, which is the the fundamental body of the UN, which works on climate change, has been making this argument that we need to reduce our emissions by 2 degrees, and then 2 years ago, that whole ambition was changed that why do we need to do 2 degrees? We should be actually reducing it by 1.5 degrees. And so this whole research and whole comparison came in that even a 0.5 degree temperature makes a huge difference. And this graph is, or this graphic is really useful to see that if we have a 1.5 degree temperature rise, that would actually cause extreme heat. But if it goes to 2 degrees, we'll be 2.6 times worse off. If we look at the sea ice in the Arctic, we know that it's always frozen. But with a 2 degree rise, we know that every 10 years we'll see ice-free summers, which is quite alarming as well. And then look at the sea level rise. It goes 0.6 meters high if we go from 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. Similarly, I think there is a huge loss in plants, in insects, and that intensity actually goes up several times when we move from a 1.5 degree to a 2 degree. And if you look at where we are currently, we're obviously at a 1 degree temperature. So this basically means is that if the global temperature moves by 0.5 degrees or 1 degree, the impacts are going to be severe. And that's where we really have to focus on. But that's not it. This is just some of the facts. But if we look at the agriculture sector, we know that yields will go down. We know that prices will go up. We know that there's going to be extreme, water shortages as well. So there's a huge impact when we talk about 1.5 degree temperature rise. So what does that mean? How do we actually, this graph actually shows you that, obviously our temperature has been rising over a period of time, but now for us to limit it and go down by, to a 1.5 degree world, what we really have to do is reduce our emissions by 50% the next 10 years. By 2030, we have to be at half of the emissions that we're doing right now. And by 2050, we have to be at a net zero. And when I say net zero, it doesn't mean that we're not emitting. It means that, there isn't any net emission. So that means, any emissions that go out, we have other measures of drawing those emissions down as well. So it doesn't mean that we will not have any fossil fuel. Of course, we live in a world where there will be a lot of fossil, but we need to have a net zero element. So you can see when you look at the graph, it's quite alarming that we need such a steep drop. And that's happened because we've obviously left it too late, but still there are lots of opportunities, there are lots of pathways to get to net zero. And I think that's where this whole conversation goes as well. And we know that this will be quite difficult without large scale negative emissions. We can't just reduce the emission. We have to find ways of getting technologies for getting negative emissions as well. So what does the other thing that I wanted to actually bring in today was this post-COVID situation. And what we've seen obviously in this post-COVID situation is that, and research has come out, people have been tracking, Oxford has been doing lots of work in this as well, that there've actually been a 17% drop in CO2 emissions since the COVID experience. And of course, COVID has been terrible for everyone. It's caused a lot of human loss. We've had tremendous amount of economic loss as well. But one thing that also came out of this is that, because all the activities stopped, the emissions dropped significantly. And so if I go back on the graph, if you look at the trajectory of dropping down, the COVID kind of drop shows us that that's the sort of emergency we require. That's the sort of drop we require. And we don't want that pain. The amount of pain that we've all experienced, the amount of disruption that we've experienced, that's the level of emergency that would be required to make this happen. And so we really have to think forward and really have to think about, what could be a different opportunity? What could be a pathway that takes us there without taking so much pain, without having so much, of the suffering that we've had? Here's a, kind of a nice a time lapse of how the emissions have been spreading, how the emissions have been dropping post-COVID. So I'll just play this for a second, and you'll see the date going. And so we see that it's started from China, where emissions started back in January. But within like a couple of months, like in March, in April, we had a 17% drop. But what's again alarming here is that as soon as countries started opening up, our emissions have started to go back up. So we know that, we can't stay in a business as usual situation, because as we open up the economies, as people go back to work, as we start using transportation, the emission cuts will go back to where they were. And so the 17% drop is just an anomaly. But also it's an opportunity for us to reflect, how we want to see the emissions drop. So here's another really interesting kind of, when I was doing this research, really interesting graph, which shows, how the CO2 emissions have been rising over a period of time, but also some of the global events that have happened. And we can see, from the Spanish flu to the Great Depression to the financial crisis, that every time a crisis happened, CO2 emissions do drop, but then they rapidly rise. Like the financial crisis was supposed to be like a really significant event. But when we look at the financial crisis from a CO2 emissions perspective, I think it was only 500 million tons that dropped. In fact, within 2010, almost 6% emission rise happened. So we know that even in a post-COVID situation, unless and until we do something dramatically, these emissions will rise again. The other aspect that I wanted to speak about, and that's where my research comes in, is this big question that, now that we know that emissions are rising, now that we know that, even events like COVID have a temporary impact on CO2 emissions, but what we really require are drastic measures. So this is a really interesting picture from 2013 from the Conference of Party that happened in Warsaw. This is just before the Paris Agreement, where a lot of activists came in and they went and focused on the fact that where will the financing come from? We have a lot of huge ambition. When we look at the graph going down as well, and we need huge amounts of technology, where will that actual money come from? And so they raised this campaign to see where do we get funding and financing from? And that's where I've been looking, that's where I've been focusing on also, that where is actually the funding and finance coming from for this big ambition for climate change. So if you look, and I did some kind of, I looked at some numbers as well. And if you look at the COVID impact, what's really happened right now is, because of this huge tragedy, all the countries have come together and they've actually spent collectively $10 trillion in economic stimulus. And if you look at the different countries, Japan has committed 21% of its GDP, US 13%, and the number goes all the way. Certain other countries have committed, like, smaller countries have even committed like 40% or 50% of their GDP as well. But when we come back to climate finance, what we see is that, less than really $500 billion have been being spent annually. And when we look at the crisis and we look at the impacts that can cause, this amount is too small. The COVID stimulus actually dwarfs what we spend in climate change. So that's something we have to think about. How can we raise our ambition? How can we raise our funding without facing a crisis like COVID? And we don't, and I think that's what climate change is leading us towards as well. That right now we talk about, or let's focus on the next 10 years to 2030, or let's talk about 2050, which is maybe 30 years ago. But when we're in that situation, then the cost will be extremely high. So unless and until we don't start spending money at this stage, our cost is going to rise. And some of the research that I've also been doing, and I haven't presented this in the slide, is also looking at developing countries. When we look at developing countries, the amount of funding that's actually available is really, really small. Some of my research from the Green Climate Fund, which is the main climate body that has been set up by developed countries or under the COP to help developing countries tackle the impacts of climate change, has only $10 billion. That's the entire amount of money that was committed. And even after committing $10 billion, actually $5 or $6 billion came in. So when we look at numbers in trillions, and when we look at the ambition, and we look at the amount of money that's being committed to developing countries, which are actually going to experience the most impacts because their communities or their people are extremely vulnerable, then it just brings everything in perspective that, if it's all about money, how come countries cannot commit a bigger amount? Why are we talking about billions when we should be talking about trillions? If we really have to protect the environment, because we know what the impacts will be. So that's something that's been troubling, and that's been a big focus of my research as well. But I think I wanted to go on slightly positive tone as well. We've all been talking about the new normal, and I think what's really important is not a new normal, but creating a new green normal. And here's some interesting research from McKinsey, which it's not really McKinsey research, but they really put nice infographics. But what they said was, what the research says is that for every $1 million that you spend in clean energy, you generate 5 jobs. And when we look at jobs in fossil fuel, for $10 million, you create 27 new jobs. But for other sectors, energy efficiency, renewable technologies, the number of jobs are like 3-4-fold. So if we have to start spending money, and if we have to create a stimulus package, we really have to think about where do we want to spend this money. And there's enough research and there's enough opportunity to now talk about that. If we focus on green energy, if we focus on climate smart technologies or climate smart policies, then actually it would help generate the economy much faster, much better than really going back to business as usual. Because in any case, we have to move away from business as usual. So this is something that, and I'm sure if you look at other sectors, we'll see more of these elements coming out. So I wanted to end here. I'm sure I've kind of done my 10 minutes, but this was, an image I really like from The Economist that says, we're really in the preliminary round. Our whole world has stopped. Our whole life has been shaken. We're all sitting in Zoom. We're all sitting in our homes. Our children are not going to school. Everything stopped around, and that's just the preliminary round. What's really lurking behind is the impact of climate change. And unless and until we don't really start thinking about the real challenge, the real opportunity that lies within the sector, we'll always be fighting. So I think that's where I'll pause. Thank you so much. I hope I was able to give some facts, and happy to share my research on climate finance. I'm finding some really, really interesting insights, and I'm sure I'll have opportunity to share that with you. But thank you so much.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much, Abrar. I knew that in this short amount of time, you would pack it in with incredible data that, confirms we are in an emergency. And I think some of the shocking levels of lines and some of those graphs are things that we should all make sure we are finding the time to reflect on quite deeply, because it is the symbol of the emergency that we are in. And I think your call that business as usual is not going to get us where we need to go. There is a need for significant change. And I think I also really remember from your slides, I'll remember the WTF, where's the finance? And just really thinking about the level of investment that we really need to make. So thank you, Abrar. And great, you took the words out of my mouth about the slides and where people can go if they want to learn more. So we'll make sure that people can connect in with this really precious and important information. I want to use this as a moment now to transition to our next panelist, our next speaker, Kaya. And Kaya has really been spending a lot of time trying to understand and build pathways for action. So if business as usual is not an option any longer, how can we get on this incredibly important race to get to zero? So Kaya, maybe before we sort of turn it over to you with your slides to share a little bit about what you're working on in terms of addressing what can we do about this in business and investment, what's your go-to climate action song? What do you play when you've got to really kind of go into your day with a level of fierce determination?
Well, I was just looking at that, and the titles are not appropriate, but I listened to a lot of Rage Against the Machine.
Excellent. There's I think quite a few people that are listening to Rage Against the Machine to get themselves away. So thank you, Kaya. Well, over to you. Let's hear about what you've been working on at Oxford and the Net Zero tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I say that, I'll explain why I am here developing a tool. I studied political science, and here I am developing a platform. And it kind of goes back to where I guess we all sort of started at Oxford, if you're an alum on this call, in the Sheldonian Theatre. So if in case you don't remember what it looks like, I have a newspaper. That is what it looks like, completely packed in fall of 2019. We hosted a climate assembly, and it sold out as fast as Magdalen Ball tickets sold out. So if that says anything to you, I didn't attend many balls at Oxford, but apparently they sell out very quickly. And we opened it with Greta Thunberg, and we closed it with a call to Oxford to do what we're doing right now, which is to engage our partners, our investments, our finances, our partners in the career service, and our alumni. So thank you for helping me sort of secure that mandate from students from our climate assembly. And the call was to engage our partners to do as much as we could to mitigate climate change. And what that has meant is a whole-scale, university-wide raising of ambition. We now have, this is a secret, it's a information ahead of target. I'm not supposed to be announcing this, but Oxford will be announcing a net zero target well before 2050. I like to joke that it will be just 2 years before Cambridge's net zero target. But we'll have to negotiate on that. And in the process of trying to figure out how Oxford was going to strategize its net zero target, I and others at the ECI and the Smith School and the business school realized, well, actually, there's not quite enough centralized information, or there's tons of information and it's great on achieving net zero, but it's not all in one place. And if I was a business, I would be a bit lost. So while we are on this like path of engaging our partners and saying, you need to go net zero and we have to do it together in order to resolve some of the uncertainties inherent in any net zero plan, we figured we might as well sort of roll it out and make it easy. And we have some of the best available researchers at our fingertips. We're working across institutions, not just with Oxford, we're collaborating with Cambridge. And many other nonprofit and international organizations. We had a criteria setting workshop with the high-level champions at the UNFCCC, and now we are building this platform. So I'm going to share my screen, which is always embarrassing because you can see how many tabs I have open. Okay, good. Thumbs up if you can see the screen. That's a thumbs up from Char. Okay, so that was not empty. It was a very full theater. That's where this all started. Net Zero Climate is the initiative that we have, and it's a small goal. You know, ambition goes to die at Oxford, right? So the global initiative to inform and support businesses committed to a net zero transition. What is the challenge? Insufficient coordination between academia, business, and policy to guide and transparently assess net zero. The problem is that if you have different people measuring gases in different ways, approaching offsetting in different ways, approaching not offsetting or offsetting differently, we should all be reducing before we offset, of course. You might end up with different temperature outcomes. And even if it's not business as usual, it might not end up being net zero. So we have to work together and we need the information in one place. This is an interesting statistic. Not everybody knows that half the world, or over just around 49% of the global economic output is under, if not an official net zero target, a country that is considering a net zero target has it in their policy documents, it's on its way. So, I mean, that means that we're actually asking businesses to set targets that governments might not have even set yet. And it's a really important time for us to be part of that discussion and set the standard really high. So what would that look like? It would be a directory of committed members, easily searchable case studies. You'd be able to, if you are in any given industry, I mean, absolutely any industry, if you work someplace, if your child goes to school someplace, there is a responsibility to engage on whether or not your employer or your school, someone in your community who works with an institution of any kind. I guarantee you probably all wear enough hats that you have like 6 institutions that you could list right away. Just think for a moment, do they have a net zero target? And if they don't, and you were to go ask them today if they have a net zero target or if they're doing what they can to help contribute to the UK's net zero ambition, what kind of resources would you direct them towards? I personally wouldn't have an immediate website that I would share. I would certainly have to do some research. So the goal is to sort of bring it all together under one website where you could sort by industry, sort by size. We want, you know, net zero for law firms, net zero for banks, net zero for finance is a big question we get a lot because of our recent work on engagement and divestment. Our Oxford divested from fossil fuels, forgot to say that, but with the condition that if fossil fuel has a Paris-aligned net zero target, it's allowed to stay. So far, none of them do, which is an important part of the negotiation that we made. So the idea is you'd be able to search something relevant to you and find the resources, even if Oxford didn't find them, even if Oxford didn't like actually discover the original research, we will have had scientists look over them and vet them for scientific alignment of the kind of resources being proposed. And we also have like amazing resources that are already out there, thanks to the B Corp network, thanks to a lot of research in the Said Business School, the Policy School. So where are we at in the process? We have generated traction with sustainable industry leaders and international climate business networks. Again, the UNFCCC is really interested in what we like to develop because it will be independent and free, which is something I believe in. And we have gathered support and input from academic and strategic advisors, but we're always looking for more input and support, which is why in part we're sort of releasing this announcement of this project early to our alumni network of brilliant professionals who know so much about sustainability in their own work life. And so we're in the stage where we're gathering and developing tools and designing a platform. And that means that if you have tools that you know of in your sort of sector that's helpful for your industry in setting climate targets, we want to hear about it. But also that if there are gaps you know of in your sector that we need to fill by helping do that desk research, we want to hear about that too. And then we'll be developing an interactive platform with some fancy AI tools, because it wouldn't be a new project these days without some fancy AI tools. And then we'll be doing outreach. And our goal is to have this completely launched, totally interactive by COP26. So not this fall, COVID, next fall. But we'd also like to have a kind of soft site, to have a soft launch to our close partners, alumni and careers service employers, as well as some major businesses that have knocked on our door. In the meantime. So we're thinking fall of this year for a soft launch if you're interested. And we need harsh feedback because the world is counting on us to do something quality. So we'll develop this. The Said Business School is going to be providing research and tools. The Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, where I'm housed. The Environmental Change Institute, where I'm also housed. The Blavatnik School of Government, with the support from a panel of academics and practical experts, maybe some of yourselves. The platform is for SMEs, large companies, NGOs, and government. You name it, we're trying to hit it all, even if it's just to share, some high-level case studies. And I think that's the end of my presentation. I hope I didn't talk too fast or take up too much time. But
Brilliant.
I'll
Kaya, that was awesome. And I hope everyone on the line is really hearing the genuine warmth of the invitation to you all to be a part of this process. I think, the energy of this project that Kaya has really been leading for many, many months now is about how to make this very, very practical for all of you in the roles you're in. So as we heard, we need to be setting these targets. We need to be racing to zero. And what hopefully this platform will be is a way to support you all on that race, in that race and on that journey. So please, please take up the really genuine and warm invitation to be a part of this. And I think your point there, Kaya, about really needing constructive feedback. I think the idea of having critical friends that are in industry right now to really challenge us to make sure that it is robust and it is strong for its various launches that are going to come over the next year and a bit, I think is really important. So maybe we'll make sure that there's a way for anyone who does want to actively engage in this testing period to do so. I can see we're already getting a couple of questions coming in here, so that's great. Fabulous. We have about 20 minutes left, and we again are going to make sure we have some time to address some of your questions, so please keep them coming through in the Q&A box. But before we turn it over to you, I'm really pleased, Kate, that you were able to join us tonight. Kate and I work together in the B Corp movement. I should probably disclose that. I guess it's probably pretty obvious with a giant B behind me as well here. But one of the things that has been happening in the B Corp movement in relation to the climate emergency is recognizing the real importance of addressing issues around climate justice. And Kate's been a real leader in championing some of these really important conversations. And so Kate, so happy that you're here tonight to join us and to share a little bit about what's happening in the B Corp movement. Before we go into this topic though, let's hear about your song. What's your climate action, get things going song that you play in the morning?
So, I'm going to talk about being very inclusive, but my title of the song is, so it's Lenny Kravitz, Are You Gonna Go My Way? which is is very singular and it's but it does fire me up. So it's a good old song.
I love it. Are you going to go my way? See, this is great. This is going to be my like evening music now. I'm just going to sort of one after the other play these songs. Kate, over to you. Really excited to hear about what you're working on right now related to inclusion, equity, diversity, and climate justice.
Fab. Thank you. So I am just going, hopefully you can see my screen. Can you thumbs up, Shah? Yeah, great. Okay, brilliant. So as kind of Shah just mentioned, it's been an interesting time for us in the B Corporation movement, and to kind of the reason why we're talking about this, the reason why we're thinking about this is because there's a real realization in B Corp that first of all, we recognize the economic system that we have is broken, and there are lots of symptoms of that economic system being broken, and the climate emergency is one of them for sure. The other one is the social inequality that we have that's really a real challenge across the whole world, and whether that comes out through race or whether that comes from through socioeconomic experience, whatever that is. And so to be able to tackle and recreate the economic system, we need to create a world that recognizes that these are symptoms of the problem that we're trying to face. So this up here is the Declaration of Interdependence. It's what every B Corp signs essentially when they join the community. And there's a recognition here that actually not only is it something that we all need to work towards, but we recognize that we are just stewarding this for future generations. And future generations is everyone. And so therefore we really need to talk about climate justice when it comes to this. So what is climate justice? I think the really important thing to kind of recognize is that climate justice places people and equity at the center of climate action and advocacy. So it's a really broad term. It can't really be nailed down into a lot of things. The different elements of this are race, recognizing the rights of Indigenous people, looking at gender, looking at youth. It's a really broad brush, but it means it encompasses a lot of things. So today I'm very briefly going to talk to you about kind of two different elements of this. So one, we're going to talk about the problem and how that impacts climate justice, but we're also going to talk about the sector and actually how we need to recognize the need for representation when it comes to this as well. So kind of echoing a lot of what Abrar was saying earlier when he was talking about kind of the poorer countries that are disproportionately affected to climate change. And that's really important. So the kind of the global south and the poorer countries are definitely going to be at the forefront and have a severe shock when it comes to climate change. And we recognize that even more, and that inequality that faces, because actually the reality is it's the richest countries, so the richest 10% produce over half of the carbon emissions that we face. And that puts the poorest 3.5 actually only accounting for the 10th of carbon emissions. So this is a real issue, and it's a real issue for kind of two different reasons. So one, the fact that the poorer countries are going to be less resilient when it comes to that. And the reason why is often because they're going to have less disposable income. They're going to have, when food prices rises, they're going to be less able to react to this stuff. And they're going to have less security, whereas richer countries are going to have more security. They're going to probably have insurance. They're going to have somewhere to go. And that's a real issue. And on top of that, it's the richer countries that are actually contributing far, far more than the poorer countries to climate change. And then just because we're in the UK, and I like making it relevant to us, kind of looking at what does that mean for us in the UK. And I know there's actually people from all over the world on the call, but the UK emits 65 times more carbon than the average person in Malawi. And then they've even got a reference here to US and Canada and Australia, and that's even worse. It's 150 times more. So there's a real issue here when it comes to carbon emissions, and actually what the role that we should be playing as people living in those countries when it comes to tackling this. And then just taking that one step further, actually let's look at what this looks like in the UK and the experience that some people will have of the challenges when it comes to carbon emissions. So 40,000 people a year die from air pollution in the UK. And I kind of just did a little bit of research into this and looking at kind of what Mayor Sadiq Khan has said, and it said that those people who are dying are going to be disproportionately affected if they're in the poorest communities and the most deprived communities. And so that kind of social inequality is quite apparent here. But even worse still, when you look at all those different lenses and the climate justice representing the intersectionality of so many different areas. It also impacts on race as well. So Asian and Black people are most likely to live in those deprived areas. And so not only is it your socioeconomic status, it's going to make you more likely to suffer from air pollution, but also you're more likely to be from a BAME background as well. So in addition to that, and the fact that it is a real problem when it comes to the disproportionate effects of poorer communities in climate change and looking at climate justice, actually what we also need to have is a representative community. We need to be tackling this where people are represented. And actually, if you look at the UK specifically, and you look at environment professionals, I was pretty shocked to learn this, but we're the second least diverse profession in the UK, and the most diverse being farmers. And so there's a real recognition here that actually, if we want to truly create the change, if we want to represent different communities, then we need to broaden our horizons when it comes to people stepping into this space. But how can we do that? And actually, I found that's a really interesting article in Vogue by a woman called Leah Thomas. And she talks about kind of the role as she identifies as Black, and also she's an environmentalist. And she says, we tend to be well-meaning, we're forward-thinking, we're looking forward to generations to come when we're environmentalists. And yet often we're actually not representative. And how can we create that change if we don't allow, and she's referencing, she lives in the US, Black people to also rise up with us, to be able to have that. But if they're so torn by fighting their own fight, then actually how are we going to be able to help them? And actually looking at climate justice, looking at racial justice is really important when we bring this all together. And so this recognition that actually, if we're all fighting climate justice, then it enables people to also fight the climate issue as well. And so the important thing here, and one of the biggest challenges that I think that we found, is often we haven't heard those voices, and people haven't found them. And one of the things in the discussions that actually we've had is, how do we find these people? And I'm not a massive fan of the acronym BAME, and I know I've already used it once, but how do we find these BAME voices in the environmental movement? How do we showcase, how do we become more representative? And so this is a really interesting kind of site that's popped up actually during COVID, Climate Reframe, and that elevates and showcases different people working across this space to be able to reference, to ensure that when we're talking about climate and we're talking about climate justice, we're allowing a variety of voices to be heard and not just white voices, which is often the case. So I think really importantly, when we talk about climate justice, this is not about choosing. This isn't about human rights over the climate emergency. This is about this. So I'll read out this quote because I think it's the most powerful. So Sam Grant from, here we go. He's an executive director of MN 350. So it's not choosing this or that, or this, then that. It's this and that. It's both and. So when we're talking about social inequality, when we're talking about racial injustice, we need to be talking about climate justice, which is really important, and one doesn't get forgotten. So when we talk about the kind of the B Corporation movement and what we're doing, one of the big things that we've recognized here is that although we're a forward-thinking organization, actually we've also got a lot to learn, and we've got a lot of work to do. So one of the things we did is we put out a statement on the Global Climate Collective website, which you can read here or you can read on the site. But the other thing, in kind of right at the beginning of 2020, we recognized that we needed to have a climate justice learning task force to really think about where we wanted to show up and ensure that JEDI, so justice, equity, diversity and inclusion, is actually something that's a lens that's put across all of our work. And we ensure that we're literate in being able to tackle this, but also we're raising up those voices that maybe have been missed before or we haven't seen before. And just to highlight some of the work that we've also got on the Global Climate website is just a few climate resources. So looking at the diversity of voices that we need to think about here and the spectrum that climate justice really means. So whether it's youth voices, whether it's racial justice, whether it's looking at gender or Indigenous voices, this is all part of this. This can't just be nailed down to one area, and we need to start thinking a little bit broader when we come to this topic. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Kate, for sharing this and for sharing the work that the B Corp movement is doing, but also sharing your perspectives on all of this. I mean, hopefully you are all on this line tonight getting a really deep appreciation for the breadth of work that is happening in this space, the experts that are really sort of working incredibly hard to make sure that we are clear that there is a climate emergency. Preparing organizations for what they can do to set net zero targets. And I think, again, what we've just heard from Kate is really making sure that this climate action that we're undertaking is deeply rooted in the principles of climate justice. And this idea of the Jedi lens, I think, is one we all need to spend some time really thinking about, and not just thinking about, but acting upon. So again, thank you for sharing your remarks, Kate, and for pointing out some of the resources that do exist already. I would say that this is obviously an emergent space, and so we need to make sure we have places where we can share resources with one another. So I hope it's okay, Kate, if I say, I mean, I think it would be great if other people are interested in this particular conversation as well. I hope you all are, because it is a truly fundamental one to how we move forward. If you have resources you have available and want to share, or are interested in accessing the ones that we have on the Climate Collective website, please just join us in a conversation about this important topic. And I suspect that that's probably a common theme from actually all the presentations we've heard tonight. A real sort of interest in being in dialogue, recognizing that this work is critically important, and it is not going to be the work that individuals, departments, organizations do alone. It is the work of all of us working in harmony with one another. So again, hopefully you have heard loud and clear through all the presentations, a real willingness and appetite to work with you as alumni, as leaders in your businesses and in your organizations on these really important themes. I think we're going to open up for questions. We have a couple of minutes left, and I think there's a few that have come in through the question and answer, including some great song recommendations, by the way. So I'd say those of you who do have a playlist that you have as well, just put those in the chat as well. Maybe we can create a shared Oxford alumni playlist for taking climate action with climate justice at the core. Hannah, can I just ask you, I've got two questions up here. Are there others that you have coming through? I know some people have submitted some questions in advance of tonight.
That was Gareth. He's posted his question there.
Okay, great. Let me just read out this question, and I'll encourage sort of maybe each of our three speakers to just think of a response if you'd like to answer the question, and maybe provide also some closing comments. The question from Gareth we have here is, despite the climate emergency and the UK's legally binding commitment to net zero under the Paris Agreement, the UK government continues to invest heavily in major projects to expand and upgrade national highway infrastructure, in the full knowledge that road transport makes significant and increasing contribution to climate change. So the question is, how should the impact of major highway infrastructure projects on climate change be assessed, and what steps can be taken to reduce it? I should also mention that their song soundtrack, Abrar, was also Queen, We Are the Champions. So it certainly sounds like you guys are rocking to the same music. Kaya, do you want to go first? I can see your pen up there. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and what I would say to that is that they should be evaluated just like we're trying to evaluate everything on the scientific basis of whether or not they're going to be net zero by 2050. So I recently picked up a hitchhiker going to the HS2 protest, and he shared with me, and then I verified this later, that the HS2 project is not going to be net neutral for 150 years. Now that's not before 2050. So I would argue that that's out of line with Paris alignment. I mean, I think that there are going to be some instances in which our efforts to expand infrastructure, I mean, that one's complicated, right? Because it's public transportation infrastructure. There will have to be some increase in emissions, and this is what the economists will tell you and the climate scientists. There may have to be, in some places, some increase in emissions in the very short term, in the next couple of years, in order for us to invest heavily in the expansion of the technology that can get us through the transition. But that should not be a plan that is not net zero before 150 years. And so I think that if the government would like to continue with some of those projects, and I agree with you that the expansion of roads is probably not one, unless we're heavily expanding electric vehicles, which have their own kind of particulate matter issues as well, is maybe not justifiable, and should also have, they would have to have some major offsetting going on there, which they haven't invested in sufficiently. So that's my answer on that.
Thank you, Kaya. Kate and Abrar, would either of you like to address the question as well? Any thoughts from either of you on this question?
Sure, I can add something. I think that was a great answer, Kaya. I think one of the things that I think we've been thinking is, you know, a much more fundamental shift, right? So this is, for me, this is business as usual. Like government's focus on infrastructure. We're looking at, you know, how are we expanding the existing structures. And I think what this kind of time is making us realize is, you know, what's the concept of transportation? You know, why do we need to move? And I think there has been a lot of research going on in really rethinking transportation and really rethinking, you know, how do we create cities? How do we create businesses? How do we create infrastructure? You know, why do people have to travel in the first place? And I think those questions are coming, are being asked right now, because, you know, either are we traveling for work? Do we need to travel to work? So I know it's not really going towards, you know, how we can reduce the carbon emissions, but I think it requires a much more fundamental thinking. Why do we need infrastructure in the first place? And can we, you know, move away from that as well? And I think those are questions that will need to be asked, if not now, in the very near future.
Great, thank you. We have another question that's come in, and it has to do with the insurance industry. And can the insurance industry play a role in accelerating the race to zero? Anyone like to jump in on that one? Knowing that we only have a minute or two left, so I'll have to be
Maybe Kate.
quick answer.
Kate, you go.
Well, yes, of course. I think is the very short answer. It absolutely has to be, and it could be the leading change when it comes to this. We're seeing disproportionate impact. Their business model isn't going to be around if we keep going in the direction that we're going. So they have to be a leading right, and whether it comes into investment of within the insurance industry, or it's just the payouts they're going to have. So there's a huge amount of work that can be done, and I think a lot of the change that we see in finance is probably going to be led by the insurance industry. But that's just my thoughts.
Well said. Well, my friends, we're almost at time with 1 minute to go. So I just wanted to take this moment to really thank, again, all of you for dialing in tonight and joining this webinar. I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a series of conversations we can have with you all under the heading of the climate emergency, and sort of what can we do about it. So hopefully you have all picked up some really important information, a little fire under your feet to get going on taking action, some access to some resources that you can review, you can take on board for your own organizations, and ultimately a recognition that you've got the support from all of us here at Oxford on the journey that you're about to be on, and that many of you are already on. We look forward to learning with you, sharing with you, and maybe just to do a quick round the table, last comment very quickly, could I ask each of our panelists to do just one call to action? If there's one thing that the people who've been on the line with us tonight can do after this webinar ends, while we're grooving to a little Queen and Rage Against the Machine and Lenny Kravitz, what's the one thing you would like them all to do? Kate, can I start with you?
Yeah, you can. I think one of the biggest things that definitely I've been learning over the last couple of weeks is about listening and learning, and recognizing that this is a really moving beast when it comes to climate justice and the climate emergency. There's so much to learn, and there's also so much to listen to, and often we haven't heard the voices that we need to hear.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kate. Abrar, what's your call to action? One thing you'd like people to do?
Sorry. Yes. So I guess I'll go back to finance, because I think that's where I'm focusing on. I think it's really important for people to, like, within their organizations, demand, you know, how budgets are being spent, you know, how can we use that money more towards climate finance activities, because I think, you know, what governments have been able to do, they've done. I think the next phase is for private sector to really focus, and all the alumni are in a position where they can actually demand and make sure that, you know, private sector and private companies, you know, rise up. So that would be my call for action.
I love it. Demand it and rise up. This is great. Kaya, what's your call to action? What would you like everybody on the line to do?
Well, Abrar stole mine, because I was going to say, you know, a call to institutional change. You're involved in any institution or organization, any number of them. And also I would say that the next time a young person asks what they can do on climate change, you know, tell them that it's great that they're riding their bike and going vegetarian and reusing their clothing, and that's fantastic and they're amazing. And also tell them to hold the feet to the fire of the people who have the power to make institutional change. Tell them that they can be part of that process too.
Love it. Ooh, I've just gotten a whole lot of goosebumps after hearing your 3 calls to actions. Hopefully you all are too. To those of you who have put some more questions in, please know that we will do our best to try and respond to you offline. But that officially closes our event tonight. And I just want to say thank you as well to Peter, who's putting in some additional Oasis soundtracks for us. I think She's Electric. Actually, that's a pretty good one for us to be closing out with. But thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Claire, for sharing the results of the survey at the school center. A big thank you, Hannah, for putting the time in to organize this tonight with the alumni team. Again, we hope this is the first of many conversations we can have on this incredibly important topic, and we will look forward to seeing you at our next webinar series. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks.